I never knew silence could have a texture until the day my grandfather pressed an envelope into my trembling hands and told me not to open it until he was gone. The hospice room smelled like industrial soap trying to mask something sweeter, something final. October rain hammered against the window with the kind of relentless rhythm that makes you feel like the world is mourning before it has any right to. I'd been sitting in that vinyl chair for 3 hours, watching the rise and fall of his chest, counting breaths like prayer beads, when his eyes suddenly opened with a clarity I hadn't seen in weeks. "Daniel," he whispered, his voice like gravel shifting in a tin can. "I need you to listen to something I should have told you 20 years ago." My grandfather, Robert Calloway, had always been a fortress of a man, 6'3", even in his decline, with hands that could bend rebar and a laugh that could fill a warehouse. He built Calloway Precision Manufacturing from nothing, turning a garage operation into one of the most respected aerospace component suppliers in the Pacific Northwest. 47 years of 12-hour days, of missing birthdays and holidays, of building something that would outlast him. Or so I thought. "Gramps, you should rest." "Don't." The word came out sharp enough to cut. His hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping my wrist. The IV line pulled taut. "Don't tell me to rest. I've been resting for 40 goddamn years, Danny. Resting instead of fighting, sleeping instead of screaming. I've been a coward, and now I'm out of time." I'd never heard him talk like this. Robert Calloway didn't do regret. He didn't do vulnerability. He was the man who taught me to box when I was 7, who showed me how to read a machining blueprint when I was 12, who told me on my 16th birthday that weakness was a choice and he expected better from his only grandson. "What are you talking about?" He released my wrist and fumbled for the envelope on his bedside table. The movement seemed to cost him everything. When he finally pressed it into my hands, his fingers were shaking so badly I had to steady them with my own. "Everything I built," he said, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my stomach drop. "Everything you thought was mine, it wasn't. It was stolen. And the man who stole it is still out there, still living in the house that should have been yours, still breathing air he didn't earn." The envelope felt like it weighed 10 pounds. "I don't understand." "You will." His breath came in ragged pulls now. The morphine pump hummed quietly beside us. "But not yet. I need to tell you this the right way, from the beginning. Because if I don't, if I go to my grave with this poison still in me, I'll have failed you twice. Once by being too weak to fight for what was ours, and once by being too weak to even tell you the truth. I should have called the nurse. His heart rate monitor was climbing, the beeps coming faster. But something in his eyes held me frozen, a desperation I'd never seen before, a need that transcended the physical pain eating through his bones. "Then tell me," I said quietly. He nodded, settling back against his pillows, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his face. Relief, maybe, or terror at what he was about to unleash. "It was 1979, he began. "I was 32 years old, and I'd just designed something that was going to change everything." The rain kept falling as my grandfather took me back to a world I'd never known. A world where he was young and brilliant and on the verge of something extraordinary. "You have to understand what it was like back then," he said, his voice growing stronger as the memories took hold. "Boeing was king. Aerospace was everything in Seattle.
The city practically breathed jet fuel, and I was just another engineer with grease under my fingernails and dreams bigger than my bank account. He'd been working at Meridian Aerospace Technologies, a mid-sized supplier that made precision components for commercial aircraft. It was decent work, union wages, benefits that let him marry my grandmother and put a down payment on their first house in Greenwood. But Robert Calloway had never been built for decent. He wanted extraordinary. "I'd been working on something in my garage," he continued. "Late nights, weekends, every spare minute. A new type of titanium alloy treatment process. A way to make aircraft components 30% lighter without sacrificing structural integrity." Do you understand what that meant, Danny? In aerospace, every ounce matters. 30% weight reduction meant more fuel efficiency, longer range, lower operating costs. It was the kind of innovation that could revolutionize the entire industry. His hands moved as he talked, sketching invisible diagrams in the air like he used to do when I was a kid, and he'd explain how things worked. Engines, hydraulics, the physics of flight. "I was naive," he said, and the word came out like broken glass. "I thought I'd been smart. I'd kept the research separate from my work at Meridian. Did everything on my own time, with my own resources. I'd even filed the provisional patents under my own name. But I needed help to take it to the next level. I needed equipment I couldn't afford, testing facilities I couldn't access on my own. So I did what I thought was the smart thing." He paused, and his breathing became labored again. I held up the water cup, angling the straw to his lips. He took a small sip, grimaced, and waved it away. "I brought it to my supervisor," he said, "a man named Lawrence Pritchard." The way he said the name made my skin crawl. There was so much venom in those 3 syllables, so much concentrated hatred that it seemed to poison the air between us. Lawrence was 10 years older than me. MIT graduate, former Navy, the kind of guy who wore his credentials like medals. He'd taken a liking to me when I started at Meridian. Called me his protégé, took me under his wing. I trusted him, Danny. I trusted him like a brother. Maybe more than a brother, because I chose to trust him. I chose to believe he had my back. Robert's eyes were somewhere else now, seeing things I couldn't see, reliving moments that had been festering for decades. I showed him everything, every calculation, every test result, every projection. I laid it all out in his office on a Tuesday afternoon in March. It took me 3 hours to walk him through it all. And when I was done, when I'd shown him what we could build together, you know what he said? I shook my head. He said, "Robert, this is remarkable. This could be worth millions, maybe tens of millions. We need to be very careful about how we handle this." My grandfather's voice had changed, taking on a different cadence, mocking, bitter. And I thought he meant we needed to protect it. I thought he was on my side. The heart monitor beeped steadily. Outside, the rain had settled into a constant drumming. He asked me for copies of everything, said he needed to review it all in detail, run his own analysis, make sure we had our ducks in a row before we approached the company's executive team. He talked about patent protection, about development partnerships, about making sure I got proper credit and compensation. He used all the right words, Danny, all the words I needed to hear. Robert's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his papery skin. I gave him everything, every notebook, every schematic, every test result. I was so proud, so excited. I went home that night and told your grandmother we were going to be rich, that I'd done it, that I'd created something that mattered. He stopped, and the silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. "What happened?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Nothing," he said simply. "For 2 weeks, nothing." Lawrence kept saying he was reviewing the materials, running his analysis, setting up meetings with the right people. He told me to be patient, told me good things take time, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him. His hand found mine, gripping it with surprising strength. Then on a Friday afternoon, I was called into the plant manager's office. There were 3 people waiting for me: the plant manager, the head of HR, and Meridian's chief legal counsel. They told me I was being terminated, effective immediately. They said I'd violated my employment agreement by conducting unauthorized research using company resources and attempting to claim company intellectual property as my own. My breath caught. What? They had documentation, Danny. Time cards showing I'd worked late at the plant. Security logs showing I'd accessed the materials lab after hours. Equipment checkout forms with my signature. All of it was real. All of it was evidence that I'd done some of my research at the company facility. But you said... I said most of it was done at home. And it was, but not all of it. There were a few times, maybe 5 or 6 times over the course of 8 months, when I'd stayed late at the plant to use specific testing equipment I couldn't replicate at home. Nothing major, just verification tests, quality checks. I'd been careful. I'd logged it all properly, checked out the equipment through official channels. I thought I was doing it by the book. His voice cracked. But Lawrence had recontextualized everything. He'd taken those few instances and built a narrative around them. He'd gone through my work logs, my access records, my materials requests, and he'd constructed a timeline that made it look like I'd been running a shadow research program on company time with company resources. And then, this is the part that destroyed me, he presented my titanium alloy process to the company as his own discovery. I felt something cold settle in my chest. He claimed he'd been working on the same process for years, said he'd been developing it as a company project all along. He had documentation to support it too, research notes dated months before I'd shown him anything, progress reports submitted to management, budget requests for testing materials. All of it was fabricated, Danny. All of it was lies. But it was official. It was in the company record. And compared to his documented research program, my few late-night equipment checkouts looked like exactly what he claimed: industrial espionage. Jesus Christ! They gave me 15 minutes to clean out my desk. They had a security guard escort me out of the building. I wasn't allowed to take any of my personal research notebooks because they claimed everything I'd created while employed by Meridian belonged to the company. They threatened me with legal action if I tried to contest the patent filings or made any claims about the technology. They said they had enough evidence to destroy me in court,
and they wouldn't hesitate to use it. His chest was heaving now, and the tears on his cheeks reflected the cold, fluorescent light. I lost everything in 2 weeks, Danny. My job, my reputation, my life's work. The provisional patents I'd filed were contested and overturned because Meridian's legal team claimed I'd filed them fraudulently while the technology was being developed on company time. Lawrence took credit for everything. Everything. I couldn't speak. The enormity of it was too much. But that's not even the worst part, Robert whispered. The worst part came 3 months later. He reached for the envelope in my hands, tapping it with one trembling finger. Lawrence left Meridian. He took the titanium alloy process, my process, and he started his own company, Callaway Precision Manufacturing. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. What? He named it after me. Robert's laugh was broken, jagged. As a joke, maybe, or as a message, I don't know. But he built an empire on my work, Danny. My designs, my innovation. He secured the patents in his name, licensed the technology to Boeing and Airbus and every major aerospace manufacturer in the world. He made hundreds of millions of dollars. And he did it all while I worked a series of dead-end jobs, blacklisted from the industry I'd given my life to. The room was spinning. Wait, I said. Callaway Precision Manufacturing. But you always told me you founded. I lied. The words came out flat, dead. I've been lying to you your whole life, to everyone. Your grandmother knew the truth. God rest her soul. But everyone else, I let them believe I'd built something, that I was someone, because I couldn't stand the alternative. I couldn't stand being the man who got crushed, who got stolen from, who was too weak to fight back. My mind was reeling, trying to reconcile everything I'd known about my grandfather with this new, horrible reality. But you worked there, I said. I remember visiting you at the plant when I was a kid. You had an office. People called you Mr. Callaway. Lawrence hired me in 1987, Robert said quietly. 8 years after he stole everything from me. 8 years after he built his empire on my bones. He called me out of the blue and offered me a job as a senior manufacturing engineer. Good salary, decent benefits. He said it was because he respected my skills. He said bygones should be bygones. And you took it. I took it. The shame in his voice was unbearable. Because I had no choice, Danny. I'd been working at a tool and die shop in Tacoma for minimum wage. Your grandmother had diabetes. The medical bills were piling up. We were going to lose the house, and Lawrence knew it. He knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't mercy. It was power. It was his way of making sure I knew my place, that I would spend the rest of my career working in the shadow of my own stolen creation, putting in my 40 hours a week, watching him get rich off my genius, while I made a fraction of what should have been mine. His whole body was shaking now. He used to walk past my desk, Danny, 3-4 times a day. He'd smile, ask how I was doing, comment on projects I was working on, always friendly, always professional. And every single time I could see it in his eyes, the gloating, the satisfaction. He'd won, and he wanted to make sure I never forgot it. I felt something dark and hot rising in my chest, something I'd never felt before. It was rage, but deeper than that. It was a kind of foundational fury that seemed to reach down into my DNA and rewrite something fundamental about who I was. Why didn't you fight? The question came out harsher than I intended. Robert's eyes met mine, and in them I saw 40 years of accumulated pain. I tried, he whispered. I spent every penny I had on lawyers. I talked to everyone who would listen, but Lawrence was smart, Danny. So goddamn smart. He'd covered his tracks perfectly. Every piece of
documentation supported his story. Every witness who might have helped me had been either bought off or scared into silence, and I was just one man going up against a corporation with unlimited legal resources and every incentive to protect their golden boy. He coughed, and the sound was wet and painful. After 2 years, I gave up. The lawyers told me I had no case. My wife was sick. We were drowning in debt. And Lawrence sent me a message through a mutual acquaintance. He said if I dropped everything, if I went away quietly, he'd make sure I could still work in the industry. But if I kept fighting, he'd make sure I never worked anywhere again. He'd destroy what little I had left. So you just let him win? I survived, Robert said, and there was steel in his voice now. I kept a roof over your grandmother's head. I made sure you had food and clothes and a future. I swallowed my pride, and I did what I had to do. But every day, for 40 years, Danny, every single
day, I've thought about what I lost, about what was stolen from me, from us, from you. He pressed the envelope harder into my hands. Lawrence Pritchard is still alive. He's 76 years old. He retired 15 years ago with a net worth estimated at over $300 million. He lives in a mansion in Medina, right on Lake Washington. He golfs at the Broadmoor Club. He sits on charitable boards and gets humanitarian awards and has buildings named after him at the University of Washington. The world thinks he's a visionary, a pioneer, a self-made man. Robert's voice dropped to a whisper. But he's a thief, and everything he has, everything he is, he built on the broken back of my dreams. Your inheritance, Danny, your legacy. It's all sitting in his bank accounts and stock portfolios. It's all parked in his 5-car garage and hanging on his walls and compounding in his investment funds. The envelope in my hands felt like it was burning. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm dying. The bluntness of it hit like a hammer. Because I don't have time anymore. Because I need you to know the truth before I go, and because... He faltered, tears streaming freely now. Because I need someone to remember what really happened. I need someone to know that I wasn't weak, that I wasn't nothing, that I created something beautiful and it was stolen from me, and I spent 40 years in a prison of silence because I was too scared and too broken to fight back. His hand trembled against mine. I'm not asking you to do anything, Danny. That's not why I'm telling you this. I'm telling you because you're my grandson. And you deserve to know where you really come from. You deserve to know what was taken from you before you were even born. But even as he said it, even as he insisted he wasn't asking anything of me, I could see in his eyes what he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. He wanted justice, he wanted revenge, he wanted someone to finally make
Lawrence Pritchard pay for what he'd done. And God help me, sitting there in that hospice room with the rain hammering against the window and my grandfather's secrets burning holes in my hands. I knew I was going to give it to him. Robert died 3 days later. It was quiet, almost peaceful, if death can ever really be peaceful. I was holding his hand when his breathing changed, when the gaps between breaths grew longer, when the machines started their final chorus of alarms. A nurse came in and turned everything off. And then it was just silence, that same textured, heavy silence that had filled the room when he first pressed the envelope into my hands. I didn't open it right away. I couldn't. I went through the motions of the next week like I was underwater. There was a memorial service at a funeral home in Ballard. Maybe 50 people showed up, mostly former co-workers from the 20 years he'd spent at his company. People who knew him as a solid engineer, a reliable
colleague, a quiet man who kept to himself. They said nice things, generic things. None of them knew who he really was, what he'd lost, what had been taken from him. Lawrence Pritchard sent flowers. A massive arrangement of white lilies and roses with a card that read, "To a valued colleague and friend, you will be missed, Lawrence." I almost burned them right there in the funeral home. The only thing that stopped me was my mother's hand on my shoulder, her quiet voice saying, "Your grandfather wouldn't want you to make a scene." But she was wrong. She didn't know what I knew. She didn't know about the envelope. I waited until after the service. After the burial at Forest Lawn Cemetery, after the awkward reception at my mother's house where people ate finger sandwiches and spoke in hushed tones about how peaceful he looked at the end, I waited until I was alone in my apartment in Capitol Hill, sitting at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a glass of bourbon I wasn't really.
Drinking before I finally opened it. The envelope contained three things. The first was a USB drive. The second was a key to a storage unit. The third was a handwritten letter, 8 pages long, in my grandfather's precise engineer's script. I read the letter twice before I touched the USB drive. Danny, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I hope it was peaceful. I hope you were there. I hope I had the courage to tell you everything before the end, though knowing me, I probably chickened out and left half of it for this letter. I meant what I said. I'm not asking you to do anything with what I've told you. This is just information, truth, the record of what really happened, preserved so that someone other than me knows it existed. But I also need to be honest with you and with myself. I'm telling you this because a part of me, maybe the biggest part, wants you to finish what I was too weak to start. The USB drive contains everything, my original research notes, the provisional patent,
Filings. Documentation of every meeting I had with Lawrence, copies of the fabricated records he used to steal my work, timeline analyses showing the impossibility of his claims, expert evaluations I paid for back in 1982 when I was still trying to fight. It's all there, everything you'd need to understand exactly what happened. The storage unit key is for a 10 by 10 unit at Secure Space Storage in Northgate, Unit 247. I've been paying for it for 37 years. Inside, you'll find physical copies of everything on the USB drive, plus additional materials, prototypes I built, test samples, correspondence, my original notebooks. I couldn't keep it all at home. Your grandmother couldn't bear to look at it, and I couldn't bear to throw it away. So I locked it up and visited it once a year, on the anniversary of the day I was fired, just to remind myself that it was real, that I wasn't crazy, that something beautiful had existed before it was stolen. Here's what I need you to understand.
Danny, Lawrence Pritchard didn't just steal my work. He stole my life. He stole my confidence, my sense of self, my belief that the world was fundamentally just. He stole the future I should have had, the security I should have been able to give your grandmother, the legacy I should have been able to leave you. Every time I worked late at that plant, I was machining parts designed from my own stolen innovations. Every time I sat in a company meeting, I had to listen to executives praise Lawrence's vision and genius. Every time I deposited my paycheck, I was reminded that I was making in a year what Lawrence made in a week from licensing my technology. It poisoned me, Danny, slowly, like drinking small doses of arsenic every day. It turned me bitter and angry and small. It made me teach you all the wrong lessons about strength and weakness, about winning and losing, about what matters in this world. I turned my pain into philosophy and passed it on to you like it was wisdom, and I'm
sorry for that. But I'm also not sorry because it means you're hard enough to do what needs to be done. I don't know what that looks like. Maybe nothing. Maybe you'll read this letter and put it all back in a drawer and move on with your life, and that's okay. That's probably the smart thing to do. Or maybe you'll do what I should have done 40 years ago. Maybe you'll find a way to make him pay. I'm not telling you to destroy him, Danny. I'm not asking you to ruin his life or take everything from him. I'm not even asking you to get the money back. It's too late for that. And honestly, I don't care about the money anymore, but I am asking you to consider this. Lawrence Pritchard has spent 40 years living a lie. He's been celebrated for my genius. He's been rewarded for my work. He's built a reputation on stolen foundations, and everyone believes it's real. The truth matters, Danny. It might be the only thing that matters if you do nothing else. If you never take a single action against Lawrence, at least keep the truth alive. Keep these records. Remember what really happened. Tell your children someday. Don't let the lie outlive both of us. But if you want to do more, if you feel even a fraction of what I've felt every day for 40 years, then you'll find everything you need in that storage unit. I've spent decades thinking about this, about what justice would look like, about what would actually balance the scales. And I've realized something. The worst thing you can do to a man like Lawrence isn't to take his money or destroy his business. It's to expose him, to make sure everyone knows what he really is, to strip away the veneer of respectability and force the world to see the truth. He's old now. His reputation is all he has left. His legacy is everything to him. Take that away, Danny. Show the world who he really is. That would be enough. That would be everything. I love you, kid. I'm sorry I left you with this burden. But I'm also
Grateful that someone I trust will know the truth. Make me proud, Gramps. I sat at that table until the sun came up, the letter trembling in my hands, bourbon untouched, my grandfather's final request, burning itself into my brain like a brand. The truth matters. Make him pay. Show the world who he really is. I plugged in the USB drive as the first light of dawn crept through my kitchen window. The next 3 weeks were consumed by research. I called in sick to my job at a software company in South Lake Union. I was a senior product manager, the kind of role where you could disappear for a few weeks if you had a good enough excuse, and family emergency following a death was as good as they came. I emptied the storage unit on a Sunday morning, loading 37 years of carefully preserved evidence into my car. I spread it all out across my apartment until every surface was covered with papers, notebooks, prototypes, and documentation. And I learned. I learned about titanium, alloy treatments, and aerospace engineering specifications. I learned about patent law and intellectual property theft. I learned about the timeline of Callaway Precision Manufacturing's rise, how Lawrence had secured his first major contract with Boeing in 1981, how the technology had been licensed across the industry. By 1985, how the company had grown from a garage operation to a manufacturing giant with facilities in 3 states. I learned about Lawrence Pritchard himself, his biography, his career trajectory, his charitable work, his family, his reputation. And I started to see the cracks. The USB drive didn't just contain my grandfather's research. It contained his analysis, decades of meticulous documentation tracking Lawrence's claims against the timeline of actual events. Robert had been obsessive about it. He'd saved every company newsletter, every press release, every interview Lawrence had given over the years. He'd highlighted inconsistencies, noted impossible timelines, documented contradictions. Lawrence's story had changed over time, small shifts, subtle alterations. In early interviews from the 1980s, he was vague about the development timeline of the titanium alloy process. But by the 1990s, when he was being profiled in industry magazines, the story had become more specific, more detailed, and the details didn't quite add up. He claimed he'd begun research in 1977, but company records showed he'd only been hired by Meridian in late 1976, and his first year had been spent on completely different projects. He claimed he'd filed the first provisional patents in early 1979, but the actual filing dates were 3 months after my grandfather had been fired. He claimed the breakthrough had come from a series of experiments conducted over 18 months, but the research notes showed a sudden leap in understanding that coincided exactly with the week after Robert had shown him everything. My grandfather had documented all of it, every inconsistency,
Every impossibility, every lie built on top of another lie, but he'd never done anything with it. I understood why. It wasn't enough, not legally. Nothing in these documents would hold up in court after 40 years. The statute of limitations had long since passed. The witnesses were dead or scattered. The original evidence had been destroyed or was held by a corporation that would never cooperate. This wasn't a legal case. It was a historical record, a collection of truths that could never be proven in the way the law required. But that didn't mean it was useless. I started making phone calls. The first person I contacted was Dr. Marion Vickers, a professor emerita at the University of Washington, who'd written extensively about innovation in the aerospace industry. She was in her 70s now, retired to a house on Whidbey Island, but she still consulted occasionally on historical research projects. I told her I was doing genealogical research on my grandfather and had discovered
some interesting materials about his work in aerospace engineering. We met for coffee in Fremont on a grey Thursday afternoon. Dr. Vickers was a small woman with bright eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of Pacific Northwest aerospace history. I showed her copies of my grandfather's research notes, not the full archive, just enough to establish the timeline and the technical specifications. "Remarkable," she said, paging through the notebooks. "These are incredibly detailed. Your grandfather was clearly a gifted engineer." "Did you ever hear of him?" I asked. "Robert Callaway?" She frowned, thinking. "The name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. What company did he work for?" "Meridian Aerospace Technologies, and later Callaway Precision Manufacturing." Her expression changed. "Callaway Precision, Lawrence Pritchard's company. Named after my grandfather." Her eyebrows rose. "Really? I didn't know that." "The company history says Pritchard founded it and named it after himself."
Callaway was his middle name, I thought. It's not. His middle name is Edmund. You can check his birth certificate. I watched her process this, saw the wheels turning. "Dr. Vickers, I need to ask you something sensitive. Hypothetically, if you were looking at 2 sets of research notes, one from 1978 and one allegedly from 1977, what would you look for to determine which came first?" She understood immediately what I was really asking. "Chronological markers," she said slowly. "References to external events, to other published research, to available materials and technologies. The evolution of thinking, whether ideas develop progressively or appear fully formed. The nature of the questions being asked versus the answers being provided. And if one set showed progressive development and the other showed sudden complete understanding, then I'd question the stated timeline of the second set." Her eyes met mine. "Daniel, what exactly have you discovered?" I spent the next 2
hours telling her everything. To her credit, she listened without interruption. She took notes, she asked clarifying questions, and when I was finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long time. "This is explosive," she finally said. "If even half of what you're telling me is true, it would fundamentally rewrite the history of aerospace innovation in the Pacific Northwest. Pritchard is considered one of the great engineering minds of his generation. There's a scholarship named after him at UW Boeing, commissioned a portrait of him for their corporate headquarters. I know. Do you understand what you're suggesting, the implications of this? I understand that my grandfather spent 40 years living with the consequences of being robbed, and Lawrence Pritchard spent 40 years being celebrated for it. Dr. Vickers nodded slowly. I'd like to examine the full archive, with your permission. Why? Because if what you're telling me is true, it's history. It matters, not just for your grandfather's legacy, but for the integrity of the historical record. We owe it to the truth. I left that meeting with my first ally. Dr. Vickers was meticulous. Over the next month, she went through everything, every notebook, every schematic, every piece of documentation. She brought in colleagues, experts in materials, science and aerospace engineering, people who understood the technical details in ways I never could. They verified my grandfather's work, confirmed the timeline, documented the inconsistencies in Lawrence's claims, and then she started writing. I'm planning a paper for the Journal of Aerospace History, she told me during one of our weekly meetings. It won't make direct accusations, I can't, not without opening myself up to legal liability, but I can present the evidence. I can lay out the timeline, I can ask questions that people in the industry will understand. How long? Peer review takes time, 6 months, maybe 8 before it's published, but once it's out there, it's part of the permanent academic record. People will start asking questions, other researchers will dig into it, the story will grow. 6 months felt like forever, but it was a start. While Dr. Vickers worked on the academic angle, I pursued other avenues. I started with LinkedIn, tracking down former employees of Meridian Aerospace Technologies from the late 1970s. Most of them were retired or dead, but I found a handful who were still alive and willing to talk. I contacted them carefully, framing my questions as part of a family history project. One of them, a former quality control inspector named Gerald Houseman, remembered my grandfather. Bobby Calloway, he said over the phone, his voice rough with age and too many cigarettes. Hell of an engineer, brilliant guy. Always wondered what happened to him. What do you remember about him leaving Meridian? It was sudden. One day he was there, next day he was gone. There were rumors. You
know the way there always are. People said he'd been stealing company secrets, trying to claim credit for work that wasn't his. But I never believed it. Bobby wasn't like that. Did you ever hear anything about Lawrence Pritchard? There was a long pause. Why are you asking about Pritchard? He and my grandfather worked together. Yeah, they did. Another pause. Look, I don't like to speak ill of people, especially not people as successful as Pritchard. But there was always something off about that whole situation. Bobby gets fired for stealing company secrets. And then 3 months later, Pritchard leaves and starts his own company using technology that sure as hell looked a lot like what Bobby had been working on. A few of us talked about it at the time, but what were we going to do? We were just hourly workers. And Pritchard, he was connected. He knew how to work the system. Did anyone ever investigate? Not that I know of. The company line was that Pritchard had
developed the technology as part of a company research program, and they'd negotiated a licensing agreement when he left. Everything was official. Everything was legal. But I'll tell you what I told my wife at the time. The timeline was wrong. I'd seen Bobby's work. I'd seen how far along he was. And then I saw Pritchard's new company debut technology that was damn near identical. The math didn't add up. Would you be willing to go on record with that? Son, I'm 83 years old. I've got prostate cancer and a bad ticker. What the hell are they going to do to me? Yeah, I'll go on record. If someone's finally asking questions about what happened to Bobby Calloway, I'll tell them what I saw. I recorded a 2-hour video interview with Gerald 3 weeks later. He died 6 weeks after that, but his testimony was preserved. I found 3 other former Meridian employees who corroborated parts of the timeline. None of them had smoking gun evidence, but collectively they painted a picture that supported my grandfather's version of events. I also started digging into Lawrence Pritchard's current life. He was 76 years old, living in a waterfront mansion in Medina worth approximately $18 million. He was married to his second wife, a former Miss Washington who was 20 years his junior. He had 3 children from his first marriage and 5 grandchildren. He served on the boards of the Museum of Flight, the Seattle Symphony, and the Washington Aerospace Partnership. He donated over $20 million to various charities over his lifetime. On paper, he was a pillar of the community, a success story, a self-made man who'd built an empire through vision and hard work. But I knew the truth. I knew every dollar in his bank account was stolen. Every award was unearned. Every accolade was based on a lie. And I was going to make sure everyone else knew it too. The first crack in Lawrence's carefully constructed facade came from an unexpected direction. I'd been reading through old newspaper archives, tracking coverage of Callaway Precision Manufacturing over the decades, when I came across an article from 1994 about a lawsuit. A former employee had sued the company for wrongful termination, claiming he'd been fired for raising concerns about safety violations. The case had been settled out of court and the details were sealed, but the article mentioned that the plaintiff's attorney had raised questions about the company's engineering practices and quality control procedures. I tracked down the attorney, a man named Richard Chen, who was now a partner at a firm in Bellevue. "I remember that case," he said when I called. "It was messy. The plaintiff had legitimate concerns, but the company had deep pockets and good lawyers. We settled for nuisance value and my client signed an NDA. What were the concerns? I can't discuss that, but I can tell you this. Callaway Precision was not the squeaky clean operation they presented to the public. There were issues, corners being cut, documentation that didn't quite add up. What if I told you those issues might have started at the very beginning, that the company's foundational technology might have been stolen?" Chen was quiet for a moment. "I'd say that's a hell of a claim to make without evidence." "I have evidence." "How much?" "Enough." Another pause. "Send me what you have. If it's what you say it is, we might have a conversation." I sent him everything, the full archive, all of Dr. Vickers's analysis, the witness statements, the timeline documentation, everything. He called me back 3 days later. "Jesus Christ," he said. This is real. This is potentially criminal fraud on a massive scale. It's real. The statute of limitations has run on most of this, maybe all of it. I'd need to do more research, but you're looking at violations that occurred over 40 years ago. Legally, there's probably nothing we can do. My heart sank. "But," he continued, "that doesn't mean there's nothing to be done. There are other avenues, professional ethics complaints, industry investigations, public disclosure. The court of public opinion can be just as powerful as a court of law, especially for someone like Pritchard, whose reputation is his most valuable asset. What do you suggest? Let me make some calls. I know people at the SEC, at the Washington State Bar Association, at industry regulatory bodies. If there's a way to put pressure on Pritchard, I'll find it. That conversation happened in June. By July, things started to move. The Washington State Professional Engineers Board opened an inquiry into whether Lawrence Pritchard had violated professional ethics standards in the acquisition and patenting of the titanium alloy treatment process. It was preliminary, not a formal investigation, but it was on the record. Dr. Vickers's paper was accepted for publication in the Journal of Aerospace History. It was titled, "Re-examining the Provenance of Advanced Titanium Alloy Treatment Processes, a Timeline Analysis of Innovation in Pacific Northwest Aerospace, 1977 to 1982. The abstract was dry and academic, but the implications were explosive for anyone who knew how to read between the lines. Richard Chen filed a complaint with the Better Business Bureau and the Washington State Attorney General's Office, raising questions about the accuracy of Callaway Precision Manufacturing's corporate history and suggesting that there might be grounds for consumer protection investigation given that the company had marketed itself based on potentially fraudulent claims about its technological innovation. None of these actions were going to bring down Lawrence Pritchard overnight, but they were creating noise. They were putting his name in databases and records. They were starting to chip away at the perfect veneer. And I was just getting started. In August, I did something risky. I created a website. It was simple, professionally designed, and devastating in its factual presentation. I called it the Callaway Project, documenting stolen innovation in American aerospace. The site laid out the entire story. It presented the evidence chronologically, with scanned copies of documents, photographs, video testimonies, expert analysis, and timeline comparisons. It didn't editorialize, it didn't make accusations. It simply presented the facts and let people draw their own conclusions. I made sure everything was sourced. Every claim was backed by documentation. Every timeline was verifiable. I consulted with 3 different attorneys to make sure nothing on the site crossed the line into libel or defamation. It was all truth, all evidence, all public record. And then I promoted it. I contacted aerospace industry journalists. I reached out to bloggers who covered engineering history. I posted links in relevant Reddit communities and engineering forums. I sent the link to alumni associations at MIT and UW, to aerospace engineering departments at universities across the country, to historical societies and industry organizations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, the site had over 50,000 unique visitors. Industry publications started reaching out, asking for interviews. The Seattle Times ran a front-page feature titled "New Questions Raised About Aerospace Pioneers' Legacy." Bloomberg picked up the story. Forbes did a piece examining the patents and timeline discrepancies. Lawrence Pritchard issued a statement through his attorney calling the allegations baseless and defamatory and threatening legal action. But he didn't sue. He couldn't, because everything on the site was true, and a lawsuit would only generate more publicity and forced discovery that would likely uncover even more evidence. Instead, he tried to ignore it. He gave no interviews. He made no public appearances. He hunkered down in his mansion and waited for the storm to pass. But I wasn't going to let it pass. In September, I filed a formal complaint with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, requesting a review of the patents underlying Callaway Precision Manufacturing's core technology. I provided the full archive of my grandfather's prior art, expert testimony about the timeline impossibilities, and documentation of the fraudulent circumstances surrounding the original patent filings. The USPTO doesn't move quickly, but once a formal complaint is filed, it's part of the permanent record. Anyone doing due diligence on the company or its patents would find it. I also reached out to my grandfather's old company, or rather, the company that had purchased Meridian Aerospace Technologies in a merger back in 1998. The parent corporation was now a multinational defense contractor with a reputation to protect. I sent them a detailed letter outlining the evidence and suggesting that they might want to review their historical records and corporate disclosures related to the acquisition and subsequent licensing of the titanium alloy technology. Corporate legal departments hate uncertainty, they hate exposure, they hate the possibility that some long-buried secret might surface and create liability. 3 weeks later, the parent corporation announced it was conducting an internal investigation into the historical provenance of certain technologies acquired through the Meridian merger. They tried to bury the announcement in an earnings call footnote, but the aerospace trade press picked it up immediately. The dominoes were falling. In October, the Museum of Flight quietly removed Lawrence Pritchard's name from a planned exhibit on Pacific Northwest aerospace innovation. The official reason was budgetary constraints and exhibit redesign, but everyone knew what it really meant. The University of Washington announced a review of the Pritchard Engineering Scholarship to ensure alignment with university values and historical
accuracy. 2 of the 4 boards Lawrence served on asked for his resignation. He complied without comment. I watched it all unfold from my apartment, tracking every development, documenting every crack in his reputation, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not joy, just a deep, bone-weary sadness. Because none of this brought my grandfather back. None of it gave him back the 40 years he'd lost. None of it erased the humiliation, the bitterness, the poisonous shame that had eaten at him every single day until the cancer finally took him. Justice, I realized, was a cold and hollow thing, but it was the only thing I had left to give him. The breaking point came in November. A Seattle Times investigative team had been working on a deep dive investigation into the whole story. They'd interviewed dozens of sources, reviewed the evidence, tracked down additional witnesses, and examined corporate records going back decades. Their findings were going to be
published as a multi-part series. Lawrence Pritchard knew it was coming. His attorney had been contacted for comment, given a detailed list of the allegations and evidence that would be presented, and Lawrence knew he was out of options. He could deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. He could claim it was all a misunderstanding, but the timeline was damning. He could try to muddy the waters with countersuits and PR campaigns, but at 76 years old, what was the point? The fight would consume whatever time he had left, and he'd already lost the only thing that mattered, his reputation. The Seattle Times article ran on a Sunday. Part 1 was titled "The Greatest Theft in Seattle Aerospace History: How One Man Built an Empire on Stolen Innovation." It was comprehensive, balanced, and devastating. They'd found evidence I hadn't known existed, including a former Meridian executive who confirmed that the company had knowingly covered up the theft to protect their licensing agreements with Lawrence's new company. They tracked down financial records showing that Lawrence had actually paid the executive a substantial consulting fee shortly after leaving Meridian, essentially a bribe to ensure the official story held. The article included photographs of my grandfather's original research notebooks alongside Lawrence's patent filings, showing the identical nature of the work. It included expert testimony from multiple materials, scientists confirming that there was no way Lawrence could have developed the technology in the timeline he claimed. It included testimony from former employees describing Lawrence's vengeful treatment of anyone who questioned the official story. It was everything. The complete, undeniable truth presented in the most mainstream and credible platform possible. The article went viral. Within 24 hours, it had been shared over 100,000 times. Every major news outlet picked it up. The aerospace industry was in an uproar. Boeing and Airbus both announced reviews of their supplier relationships and historical licensing agreements, and Lawrence Pritchard disappeared. Not literally. He didn't flee the country or go into hiding. He just retreated completely from public life. No statements, no appearances. His attorney issued a one-sentence response. Mr. Pritchard maintains that the allegations are inaccurate and declines further comment. But his silence was its own kind of admission. I thought that would be the end of it. The truth was out. Lawrence's reputation was destroyed. My grandfather's story was told. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But then something happened that I didn't expect. In early December, I received a phone call from an attorney I didn't recognize. "Mr. Hawthorne," the voice said, "my name is Patricia Wolfe. I represent the estate of Lawrence Pritchard." My heart stopped. Estate? Is he... Mr. Pritchard is alive, but he's recently been diagnosed with
advanced pancreatic cancer. His prognosis is poor. He's made the decision to put his affairs in order, and part of that process involves addressing certain historical matters that have come to light. I didn't say anything. Mr. Pritchard would like to meet with you in person. He has something he'd like to discuss regarding your grandfather and the events of 1979. Is this some kind of legal trap? No, Mr. Hawthorne. I can assure you this is not a legal matter. Mr. Pritchard is not seeking to sue you or suppress the information that's been made public. He simply wishes to speak with you directly. I can arrange for the meeting to be recorded if you'd like. Everything will be documented. I should have said no. I should have hung up and walked away and let Lawrence Pritchard die with his guilt. But I didn't. When? We met at his house in Medina on a cold Tuesday afternoon in mid-December. The mansion was exactly what I'd expected. Massive, modern glass and steel, and carefully manicured landscaping overlooking Lake Washington. There was probably $10 million worth of art on the walls. The furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. Lawrence Pritchard was sitting in a wheelchair near the windows, looking out at the water. He'd lost weight, a lot of weight. His skin had the grey, papery quality of someone who'd been eaten from the inside, but his eyes were still sharp. Patricia Wolfe sat to one side with a recording device. I sat across from Lawrence in an expensive chair that was probably worth more than my car. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Lawrence said, You look like him, your grandfather. Same eyes, same stubborn set to your jaw." "I didn't come here for small talk." "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose you did." He shifted in his wheelchair, grimacing with pain. "I'm dying, Mr. Hawthorne. Weeks, maybe. A month if I'm unlucky."
and I find that I'm not quite ready to face whatever comes next with this particular sin still on my soul. You
Want absolution. I want to tell you the truth. Whether that amounts to absolution is up to you. He reached for a glass of water on a nearby table. His hands shook. He took a sip and set it down carefully. Your grandfather was brilliant, Lawrence said. Truly brilliant. The kind of mind that comes along maybe once in a generation. When he showed me that titanium alloy process, I knew immediately what I was looking at. It was revolutionary. It was going to change everything. And I was looking at it through the eyes of a man who'd spent 10 years grinding away in the aerospace industry, working for other people, watching less talented men get promoted because they knew the right people or came from the right schools. He paused, breathing heavily. I told myself I deserved it more than he did. He was young, he'd have other ideas, but this was my chance, my one shot at building something real, so I took it. You stole it. Yes. The word came out flat. I stole it. I fabricated evidence. I bribed executives. I destroyed your grandfather's career and reputation. I built everything I have on his work, and I've spent 40 years being celebrated for it. He looked directly at me, and I am genuinely, truly sorry. The apology hung in the air like smoke. Sorry doesn't give him back his life, I said. No, Lawrence agreed. It doesn't. Nothing can do that. But I want you to know that it wasn't easy. Living with it. Every success felt hollow. Every award felt like a lie. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that the past was past, that I'd earned my success through what I built after the initial theft. But it did matter. It always mattered. Then why didn't you ever come forward? Why didn't you ever try to make it right? Because I was a coward. He said it simply, without drama. Just like your grandfather was a coward for not fighting harder, I was a coward for not admitting the truth. We were both weak men, Mr. Hawthorne. We just failed in different
ways. He reached down beside his wheelchair and pulled out a leather portfolio. He handed it to Patricia Wolfe, who brought it to me. Inside that portfolio is a signed, notarized statement detailing everything I did. The theft, the fabrication, the bribery, the cover-up. All of it. It's legally inadmissible. The statute of limitations is run, and I've structured it carefully to protect myself from any remaining criminal liability. But it's the truth. Complete and unvarnished. I opened the portfolio. The statement was 50 pages long. There's also a check, Lawrence continued. Made out to you. It's for $10 million. I stared at him. I've calculated as best I can what your grandfather's fair share of the profits from the titanium alloy technology should have been over the past 40 years. It's not perfect. It's probably not enough, but it's what I can afford to give without destroying the financial security of my children and grandchildren who had nothing to do with
my sins. I don't want your money. I know you don't. But take it anyway. Put it in a trust. Start a scholarship in your grandfather's name. Fund research grants for young engineers. Do something good with it. Because I can't. Not anymore. Everything I've touched is tainted. But you can turn my theft into something that actually helps people. I looked down at the portfolio in my hands, at the check, at this dying man's attempt to buy some kind of peace. There's one more thing, Lawrence said. I've instructed my estate to fund the creation of the Robert Callaway Center for Engineering Ethics at the University of Washington. $50 million. It will teach engineering students about intellectual property rights, about ethical responsibilities, about the importance of integrity in innovation. and it will make sure that everyone who studies aerospace engineering at UW knows your grandfather's story, knows what was stolen from him, knows that his work changed the industry.
He leaned back in his wheelchair, exhausted. That's all I can offer you, Mr. Hawthorne. The truth in writing. Financial compensation, inadequate though it is. And a legacy for your grandfather that will outlast both of our families. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's everything I have left to give. I sat there for a long time, looking at this broken old man who'd built an empire on my grandfather's bones. And I realized something. This wasn't about justice anymore. It never really had been. Justice would have been Lawrence Pritchard being caught in 1979, being prosecuted, being punished. Justice would have been my grandfather building his company, living his dream, dying wealthy and celebrated. This was just the messy aftermath, the attempt to find meaning in the ruins, the desperate human need to believe that the truth mattered, that wrongs could somehow be righted, even decades too late. "I'll take your statement," I said, finally, "and I'll take the money, but
only for the scholarship and research grants, and I'll watch as the centre gets built, and I'll make sure it tells my grandfather's story accurately. Thank you, but I don't forgive you." The words came out harder than I intended. You can't apologize your way out of what you did. You can't buy redemption. You stole 40 years from a good man, and he died bitter and broken because of it. No amount of money or public acknowledgement changes that. Lawrence nodded. I know. He deserved better. He did. And you deserve worse than you're getting? I know that too. I stood up, clutching the portfolio. Goodbye, Mr. Pritchard. Goodbye, Mr. Hawthorne. I walked out of that mansion and didn't look back. Lawrence Pritchard died 3 weeks later, on January 4th. The obituaries were conflicted. Some focused on his engineering achievements and charitable giving. Others prominently mentioned the controversy surrounding the origins of his company. The Seattle Times ran a balanced
piece that presented both sides, the empire he'd built and the theft it was founded on. I didn't attend the funeral. Instead, I spent that day at my grandfather's grave in Forest Lawn Cemetery, sitting on the cold ground beside his headstone, telling him everything that had happened. The statement Lawrence had given me was now part of the public record. I'd provided copies to Dr. Vickers, to Richard Chen, to the Seattle Times, to the Patent and Trademark Office, to anyone who'd been involved in exposing the truth. It was irrefutable evidence, straight from the source. The University of Washington had accepted the funding for the Robert Callaway Center for Engineering Ethics. Ground would be broken in the spring. The first classes would be taught in 2 years. The $10 million had been placed in a trust that would fund the Robert Callaway Memorial Scholarship for promising young engineers from working-class backgrounds. The first awards would be given out next fall. Boeing had issued a statement acknowledging that their foundational titanium alloy licensing agreements were based on technology originated by Robert Callaway, and they'd made a substantial donation to the scholarship fund. My grandfather's name was being restored. His story was being told. The historical record was being corrected. It should have felt like victory. But sitting there in the cold January afternoon, looking at the simple headstone that read, Robert James Callaway, 1947 to 2025, beloved husband, father and grandfather. All I felt was tired. I did what you asked, Gramps, I said quietly. I showed the world who Lawrence Pritchard really was. I made him pay. I got the truth out there. A crow cawed somewhere in the distance. The wind rustled through the bare trees. But I don't know if it mattered. I don't know if any of this made a difference. You're still gone. Those 40 years are still lost. And I'm sitting here talking to a piece of granite because you're not here to see any of it. I put my hand on the cold stone. I hope you're at peace. I hope wherever you are, you know that people finally understand what really happened, that your work is being recognized, that your name means something more than just silence and bitterness and stolen dreams. I stayed there until the light started to fade, until the cemetery groundskeeper came by to tell me they were closing the gates. As I walked back to my car, I thought about everything my grandfather had taught me, about strength and weakness, about winning and losing, about the difference between justice and revenge. He'd been wrong about a lot of things. His pain had made him hard and bitter, and he'd passed those lessons on to me like they were wisdom. But he'd been right about one thing. The truth mattered. Not because it could change the past, not because it could undo what had been done, but because without truth, we were just living in other people's lies. We were just accepting the world as it was presented to us, never questioning, never digging deeper, never demanding that reality align with what we knew in our bones to be right. My grandfather had lived with a lie for 40 years because he'd been too broken to fight it. But in the end, he'd found the courage to pass the truth to me. And I'd found the strength to make sure it survived him. That had to mean something. That had to be enough. 3 months later, I was back at work, trying to rebuild the parts of my life I'd neglected while pursuing Lawrence Pritchard's ghost. The website was still up, still getting thousands of visitors every month. I'd started getting emails from people with their own stories of stolen innovation, of workplace betrayal, of injustices that had never been addressed. I couldn't help all of them. I couldn't even help most of them, but I tried to point them toward resources, toward people who might be able to assist, toward the kind of justice that was possible even when the legal system had moved on. The Robert Callaway Center for Engineering Ethics had its groundbreaking ceremony in April. I gave a speech about my grandfather, about the importance of integrity in innovation, about the cost of silence in the face of injustice. People applauded. Photographers took pictures. A young engineering student came up to me afterward and told me my grandfather's story had inspired him to pursue his own research ideas despite pressure from his advisor to work on someone else's project. That felt like something. Dr. Vickers published a second paper, this one incorporating Lawrence's confession and examining the broader patterns of intellectual property theft in the aerospace industry during the 1970s and 1980s. It won an award from the Society for the History of Technology. Richard Chen called to tell me that the Washington State Professional Engineers Board had posthumously revoked Lawrence Pritchard's professional engineering license and had implemented new ethics training requirements for all
licensed engineers in the state. Small victories, incremental changes, the slow, grinding work of turning personal tragedy into systemic improvement. But I still thought about my grandfather every day. I thought about the life he should have had, the company he should have built, the pride he should have felt instead of the shame that had eaten him alive. And I thought about the envelope he'd given me in that hospice room, trembling with the weight of 40 years of silence finally broken. The truth matters, he'd written. It might be the only thing that matters. I'd proven him right in the end. The truth had mattered. It had toppled a giant. It had rewritten history. It had restored a name that had been buried under lies. But it hadn't brought him back. It hadn't given him back those 40 years. It hadn't made him whole. And that, I realized, was the final lesson. The one my grandfather couldn't teach me, because he didn't live to see how this all played out. Justice isn't resurrection. Truth isn't time travel. Revenge isn't healing. They're just the things we do to mark the passing, to say that someone was here, that their pain mattered, that their story deserved to be told. My grandfather, Robert James Calloway, was a brilliant engineer whose revolutionary innovation transformed the aerospace industry. He was robbed of his life's work by a man he trusted, and he spent 40 years living in the shadow of his own stolen genius. But in the end, he found the courage to speak, and I found the strength to make sure the world listened. That's not the ending he deserved, but it's the ending we built together across the gap between life and death, between silence and truth, between weakness and whatever lies beyond it. I like to think he would have been proud. I like to think it was enough. 6 months after Lawrence Pritchard's death, I received a letter. It was from his daughter, Catherine. We'd never met, but I recognized her name from the obituary. The
letter was handwritten, 5 pages long, and it took me 3 tries to get through it. Dear Mr. Hawthorne, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if you'll care, but I needed to write it anyway. My father died with your grandfather's name on his lips. His last coherent words were an apology to Robert, to you, to everyone he'd hurt. The hospice nurse said she'd never seen someone so desperate to be forgiven, even as the morphine took everything else away. I grew up believing my father was a great man, a genius, a self-made success story. Learning the truth destroyed something fundamental in my understanding of the world, of him, of myself. But I'm grateful you exposed it. Not because I enjoyed watching my father's reputation crumble, not because I wanted to see him suffer, but because living a lie, even a comfortable lie, is its own kind of prison. And you freed us from that prison even though it hurt like hell. I've been going through his papers, his real papers, not the
sanitized version he showed the world. I found journals, letters, documents that show just how deeply the theft had eaten at him. He knew what he'd done was wrong. He knew it every day for 40 years, and he chose to keep doing it anyway because admitting the truth felt worse than living the lie. That's cowardice. I see that now, but I also see something else in those papers: genuine remorse, real pain. A man who built everything he ever wanted and found it was all ashes in his mouth because he knew it wasn't really his. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm not even asking you to feel sorry for him. I'm just asking you to know that the man who hurt your grandfather wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a complicated, flawed, deeply broken person who made terrible choices and then spent the rest of his life imprisoned by them. The Robert Calloway Center for Engineering Ethics is opening next month. I'll be there. Not representing my father, but representing myself and my family. We want to help. We want to be part of making sure this story is told correctly, that the lessons are learned, that some good comes from all this pain. I hope we can meet someday. I think our families are bound together now, whether we like it or not, by the weight of this shared history. Thank you for giving your grandfather's story back to him. And I'm sorry for what my father took from you all. Sincerely, Catherine Pritchard Morrison. I read the letter 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table, trying to figure out what I felt, not anger. That had burned itself out months ago, not satisfaction. There was nothing satisfying about any of this, maybe just recognition. The acknowledgement that pain radiates outward in ways we can't always predict. That the consequences of theft and betrayal don't end with the people directly involved. That we're all carrying the weight of decisions made by people we never knew in moments we weren't present for, and we have to decide what to do with that.
Wait. I wrote back to Catherine 2 weeks later. We met for coffee in June. She looked like her father. Same sharp eyes, same precise way of speaking. But there was a softness to her that Lawrence had never had, a willingness to sit with discomfort instead of armoring herself against it. We talked for 3 hours. She told me about growing up with Lawrence, about the pressure to be perfect, about the way success had never seemed to bring him joy. She told me about finding the journals, about reading his private admissions of guilt, about having to reconcile the father she'd known with the man he'd really been. I told her about my grandfather, about the hospice room, about the envelope and everything that came after. And at some point during that conversation, I realized something. Lawrence Pritchard had stolen my grandfather's innovation, but in doing so, he'd stolen from his own family too. He'd stolen the possibility of a legacy built on truth. He'd stolen the pride of knowing their success was earned. He'd stolen the peace that comes from living with integrity. Everyone involved had lost something. Some losses were bigger than others. My grandfather's lost life versus Lawrence's lost peace of mind will never be equivalent. But we were all, in our own ways, casualties of that original sin. What do we do with this? Catherine asked. How do we move forward? I don't know, I said honestly. But maybe that's okay. Maybe not having a clear answer is part of what makes this real. If there was an easy resolution, it would just be another story instead of actual life. She nodded. The centre opens next month, she said. Will you speak at the dedication? Yes. Thank you. We finished our coffee and went our separate ways. Two people bound together by a theft that happened before either of us was born, trying to figure out how to build something meaningful from the ruins. The Robert Calloway Centre for Engineering Ethics opened on September 15th, exactly 46 years after my grandfather was fired from Meridian Aerospace Technologies. The building was beautiful, modern, glass-filled, with my grandfather's name in brushed steel letters above the entrance. Inside there were classrooms and research labs and a library dedicated to the history of innovation ethics. There was a permanent exhibit telling the story of what had happened, presenting both sides honestly, using the truth as a teaching tool. I stood at the podium during the dedication ceremony, looking out at the crowd of students, faculty, industry professionals and journalists. Catherine Pritchard Morrison sat in the front row. Dr. Marion Vickers was there, along with Richard Chen and several of the former Meridian employees who'd been willing to speak on the record. My mother was there, crying quietly, finally understanding the full story of what her father had endured. And in my mind, my grandfather was there too, young and brilliant and full of hope before everything was stolen from him. My grandfather, Robert Calloway, was an extraordinary engineer, I began. But this centre isn't about celebrating his genius, it's about learning from his pain. I told the story, all of it, the innovation, the betrayal, the theft, the 40 years of silence. Lawrence Pritchard's confession, the slow work of restoration. What happened to my grandfather was wrong, I said. legally, morally, fundamentally wrong. And it was allowed to happen because people chose silence over truth, comfort over justice, convenience over courage. I paused, looking around the room. But here's what I've learned over the past year. Exposing the truth doesn't erase the past. Getting justice doesn't bring back what was lost. Destroying the person who hurt you doesn't make you whole. I gripped the edges of the podium. So what does matter? What's the point of all this? I pulled out the letter my grandfather had written me, the one from the envelope. I'd carried it with me every day since he died. My grandfather wrote that the truth matters, that it might be the only thing that matters. And I think he was right, but not in the way I first understood it. I looked down at his handwriting, at the words written by a dying man trying to set the record straight. The truth matters because it's the foundation of everything else. Without truth, we can't have real justice. We can't have genuine progress. We can't learn from our mistakes because we can't even acknowledge what they were. I looked back up at the audience. This center exists to make sure that no engineering student graduates without understanding the ethical weight of innovation, that no young engineer makes the choices Lawrence Pritchard made because they genuinely don't know better, that the next Robert Calloway has the tools and support to fight back when their work is stolen. My voice cracked. It won't bring my grandfather back. It won't give him the life he should have had, but it will mean his.
Pain wasn't meaningless. It will mean something good grew from something terrible. I finished my speech and stepped away from the podium to thunderous applause. Catherine caught up with me afterward, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, "for letting my family be part of this, for not shutting us out." "We're all carrying this now," I said. "Might as well carry it together." I visit my grandfather's grave once a month now. I tell him about the center, about the students who are learning his story, about the research grants being awarded in his name. I tell him about the letters I receive from engineers who've been inspired by his example to fight for their own innovations, to stand up against workplace theft, to prioritize integrity over convenience. I tell him that the truth did matter, that his story mattered, that he mattered. Sometimes I imagine I can feel him listening, that somewhere in whatever comes after death he's finally at peace, but mostly I just sit.
There on the cold ground, talking to granite, carrying the weight of his secrets and his pain and his final desperate attempt to be remembered as more than a victim. The truth is complicated, justice is messy, revenge is hollow, but memory, honest, unvarnished memory that refuses to let lies become history, maybe that's the closest we get to redemption. My grandfather, Robert James Calloway, was a brilliant engineer whose work changed the world. He was robbed of his legacy and spent 40 years living in the shadow of his own genius. But in the end, he found the courage to speak. And I made sure the world listened. It's not the ending he deserved, but it's the truth. And maybe my grandfather was right. Maybe that's the only thing that really matters. 5 years later, I'm standing in the Robert Calloway Center watching a young engineering student present her research on ethical frameworks for intellectual property protection in collaborative environments. She's brilliant, passionate, uncompromising in her commitment to doing things right. She has no idea who I am. To her, I'm just another person in the audience, listening to her defend the importance of integrity in innovation. After her presentation, she lingers by the exhibit dedicated to my grandfather's story. She reads every placard, studies every document, stands for a long time in front of the photograph of young Robert Calloway in his Meridian Aerospace uniform, smiling at the camera with hope in his eyes. I walk over and stand beside her. "Did you know him?" she asks. "He was my grandfather." Her eyes widen. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry for what happened to him." "Thank you. His story is part of why I'm studying engineering ethics. I want to make sure I never make the choices Lawrence Pritchard made, and I want to build systems that protect people like your grandfather." I feel something shift in my chest, a weight I've been carrying for 5 years suddenly becoming lighter. "That's exactly what he would have wanted," I say. She smiles and goes back to studying the exhibit, and I stand there watching her, this young person who never knew my grandfather but who's been shaped by his story, who's building her entire career around making sure his pain leads to someone else's protection. And I realize this is what justice looks like when it's real. Not revenge, not punishment, not even restoration, but transformation, taking something broken and making it into something that prevents other things from breaking. My grandfather's genius was stolen from him, but his story, his true story, is now protecting countless others from the same fate. That's a legacy worth dying for. That's a legacy worth fighting for. That's enough. I walk out of the center into bright Seattle sunshine, and for the first time in 5 years, I feel like I can finally, truly let my grandfather rest. His truth has been told, his name has been restored, his pain has been transformed into purpose, and somewhere I like to think Robert James Calloway is finally at peace. The weight of silence has been lifted, and all that remains is the truth.